There's a type of person most of us have encountered at least once in our lives, someone who seems to operate on a completely different set of rules than everyone else. They don't just bend the social contract, they ignore it entirely, as though it was written for other people. And what's strange is that when you first meet them, you often don't notice. They can be charming, even magnetic. They might seem like someone who just doesn't care what others think, which, in a world full of people desperately seeking approval, can actually seem refreshing at first. But then, slowly, you start to notice something off. A casual lie that didn't need to be told. A favor that was never returned. A moment where they had the chance to show basic consideration and simply didn't. Not out of stress or distraction, out of complete indifference. And here's what most people never stop to think about. That indifference isn't random. It isn't a bad mood or a rough childhood speaking in isolated moments. Research in personality psychology suggests it's a stable, deeply ingrained orientation toward the world, a set of cognitive and emotional patterns that shape how a person perceives others, processes consequences, and decides what they owe the people around them, which for a genuinely antisocial person turns out to be very, very little. Today we're going to take a serious look at the psychology behind antisocial behavior, not in the way the word is usually used, not as a synonym for shyness or introversion, but in its actual psychological sense. The patterns, the internal logic, the moments where it becomes visible. And perhaps most interestingly, the way these people can exist so close to us for so long before we understand what we're actually dealing with. Before we go further, if you find yourself genuinely curious about how the human mind works, especially the parts we don't talk about enough, this channel is built for exactly that kind of curiosity. Hit subscribe and leave a comment right now. Have you ever had someone like this in your life? Or do you sometimes wonder if you've shown some of these patterns yourself? There's no judgment here, just honesty. Drop your thought below and let's make this a real conversation. So let's start with the thing almost everyone gets wrong about antisocial psychology. When most people hear the word antisocial, they picture someone who avoids parties, doesn't like crowds, and prefers a quiet evening alone. That's a misuse of the term that has stuck around in everyday language for decades. In psychological terms, being antisocial has nothing to do with preferring solitude. It describes something far more specific and far more socially consequential, a persistent disregard for the rights, feelings, and well-being of other people. A pattern of behavior in which others are treated as means rather than ends, as tools, obstacles, or irrelevant background noise, depending on what's useful in the moment. This distinction matters enormously because it shapes everything about how we recognize these patterns and how long it can take us to do so. The introvert who cancels plans and needs a lot of alone time, deeply considerate of the people they love, the charming, sociable person who lies with ease, never feels guilt, and leaves damage behind them like a vapor trail, that's the profile we're actually talking about. And the fact that these two things sound so different is exactly why antisocial behavior so often goes unnoticed until it's already done its damage. Psychologists and researchers who study personality have observed something particularly interesting about the way antisocial patterns are distributed across the population. Studies consistently estimate that roughly 3 to 5% of people show a stable pattern of antisocial traits significant enough to affect their relationships, their work, and the people around them. That might sound small, but think about how many people you interact with in a year, at work, in relationships, in your neighborhood, in everyday transactions. 3 to 5% means that in a group of 30 people, there's likely at least one. And because antisocial individuals are often skilled at appearing normal, functional, and even likable in the short term, that one person can operate right in your midst for a long time before the pattern becomes undeniable. Now, here's where the psychology becomes genuinely fascinating and where it diverges from what most people assume. There's a common belief that people who behave antisocially are simply angry or selfish in the ordinary way most humans can be selfish sometimes, or that they've had difficult lives and are acting out of pain. And while difficult early environments can absolutely shape personality development, we'll come back to that, the core of antisocial psychology isn't primarily about anger or even about wanting more for yourself. It's about a specific and unusual relationship with the inner emotional lives of other people. Most humans are equipped with a process called affective empathy, the capacity to feel something when they perceive that another person is feeling something. When you see someone in pain, there's a kind of resonance that happens in your nervous system. It doesn't mean you always act on it. It doesn't mean it overrides every self-interested impulse. But it's there, and it generates a kind of friction, an internal cost, to causing harm or disregarding someone's well-being. That friction is what keeps most of us in line, even when no one is watching. Not fear of consequences alone, but something closer to an involuntary sense of connection to other people's experience. Research in neuroscience and emotion suggests that individuals with strongly antisocial patterns show a measurably reduced version of this response. They can understand cognitively that someone is upset. They can read facial expressions, process emotional language, even predict how their actions will affect others. What doesn't happen, or happens at a much lower intensity, is the felt experience of that emotion registering as something that matters. There's no friction, no internal cost. Another person's pain lands differently when it doesn't produce discomfort in you. This is not the same as saying antisocial people feel nothing. That's a misconception worth addressing directly. They experience their own emotions, frustration, desire, excitement, even affection in some cases. What's altered is the specific mechanism that converts awareness of someone else's distress into a reason to modify your own behavior. Without that mechanism working at full capacity, the social contract starts to feel less like a mutual agreement and more like an inconvenient set of rules that exist primarily to limit you. And here's what that feels like from the inside, because this is where the psychology gets counterintuitive. For someone with genuinely antisocial patterns, their behavior doesn't feel cruel or wrong in the moment. It feels rational, even justified. A lie told to avoid a consequence feels like smart navigation. A promise broken when it became inconvenient feels like recognizing when a commitment no longer serves you. Taking advantage of someone's trust feels, at some level, like playing the game well. There's an internal logic, a coherent worldview, in which other people's feelings are real, but not particularly relevant to your decisions, unless those feelings affect what you can get from the situation. This is one of the reasons why confronting an antisocial person about harm they've caused tends to produce such frustrating responses, not just denial, though denial is common, but a kind of genuine bewilderment that you're making such a big deal out of something, or an immediate reversal in which somehow the harm they caused becomes evidence of something you did wrong. The explanation shifts, the blame migrates, and somewhere in that conversation you realize you're no longer discussing what happened, you're defending yourself, even though you were the one who was wronged. Psychologists call this pattern of shifting blame and reframing harm a cognitive distortion, a way of organizing experience that protects the self from accountability by making accountability itself feel like an attack. In antisocial psychology, this isn't an occasional defense mechanism. It's a habitual mode of processing social reality. The world is divided, roughly, into people who are useful and people who get in the way. And getting in the way tends to feel to them like a kind of aggression, which in their internal logic fully justifies whatever response comes next. Now let's talk about something that surprises most people: the relationship between antisocial behavior and intelligence, specifically social intelligence. There's a persistent cultural image of the antisocial person as crude, obvious, someone you'd spot immediately as a bad actor. And some people with antisocial patterns do operate that way, impulsively, visibly, in ways that put them in conflict with formal rules and institutions quickly and repeatedly. But a meaningful portion operate very differently. They are perceptive, strategically patient, and socially fluent in ways that make them difficult to identify. Researchers who study the darker dimensions of personality, sometimes grouped under terms like the dark triad, which includes antisocial traits alongside narcissism and a tendency toward manipulation, have found that some individuals in this space are remarkably good at reading what people want to hear, calibrating their presentation to match expectations, and sustaining a performance of warmth and reliability that can last for months or years. They're not doing this out of care, They're doing it because social intelligence, when paired with low empathy and reduced concern for others, becomes a precision tool rather than a relational one. You use it to get what you want, not to connect. This version of antisocial behavior is particularly hard to detect because it mimics genuine prosocial behavior so closely. The charm is real in the sense that it works. It produces warmth and trust in the people around them. The helpfulness is real when it's strategically useful. The expressions of care can be convincing. The difference is that all of it is contingent. It lasts exactly as long as it serves a purpose and disappears the moment the calculation changes. One pattern researchers have noted is what might be called instrumental kindness, a mode of generosity or warmth that functions entirely as an investment. The antisocial person who helps you when you're struggling isn't doing so out of care in the way most people would understand care. They're building credit, social credit, which means you now feel obligated, or they now have a story they can tell about themselves, or they now have access to something, your trust, your resources, your loyalty, that they didn't have before. The help is real. The motivation is completely different. And here's the thing about that. We're all capable of helping people with mixed motives. Most human generosity is not entirely pure. But for most people, the genuine care is also present. It coexists with the self-interest. What differs in antisocial psychology is the absence of that genuine dimension. It's self-interest operating in the costume of care, without the care actually being there. Let's move now to something that plays out in real time in relationships, the experience of being close to someone with strongly antisocial patterns. What people who've been in these dynamics consistently describe in friendships, romantic relationships, family structures, or professional environments, perseveran, is a specific and disorienting progression. The beginning is often genuinely good. The antisocial person can be attentive, exciting, and remarkably skilled at making you feel seen. That's not an accident. They're reading you carefully, identifying what you respond to, and providing it because doing so brings them closer to whatever they want from the relationship. This phase can last a surprisingly long time. The middle phase is usually where the first real signals appear, but they're easy to explain away. A lie that surfaces but gets smoothed over. An incident where they showed no concern for someone who was clearly hurting. A moment where the mask slipped, where the warmth vanished instantly when they didn't get what they wanted, and then snapped back in place so fast you almost doubted you saw it. These moments feel like anomalies rather than data points, because you know this person. You've seen them be kind, generous, good. You explain the moments that don't fit. The later phase is where the pattern becomes undeniable, and this is usually also the phase that causes the most damage, because by this point there's significant emotional investment, there may be shared resources or commitments, and the antisocial person has usually developed a good sense of exactly how to manage your responses. They know what you'll forgive. They know what reassurance works on you. They know how to make you feel like the problem, not through some calculating master plan necessarily. This can happen almost automatically, because reading and managing people is something they've been doing their entire adult lives. What makes getting out of these dynamics so difficult is that the harm isn't usually dramatic at first. It's cumulative. It's 100 small moments of having your reality questioned, your concerns dismissed, your experience reframed as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. And because the person causing this harm is often also capable of warmth and connection, because they're not monstrous every minute of every day, leaving feels unreasonable. You keep calibrating against the good moments, wondering if maybe you're the one getting it wrong. This is worth sitting with, because it explains a lot about why intelligent, self-aware people can stay in damaging relationships with antisocial individuals long past the point where outsiders are confused by their continued presence. It's not naivety. It's the natural human tendency to make our experiences coherent, to build a story that accounts for both the warmth and the harm, rather than accepting that both can genuinely exist in the same person, because one is real and the other was largely performance. Now let's go deeper into the developmental dimension, church, because the psychological research on where antisocial patterns come from tells a story that is, in some ways, more complicated than most people expect. There's a long-standing debate in personality research about the relative contributions of nature and environment in the development of antisocial traits, and what the evidence suggests, not conclusively, but with considerable consistency, is that the answer is genuinely both, interacting in complex ways. There appear to be temperamental dimensions that are at least partially heritable: lower baseline anxiety, reduced behavioral inhibition, diminished sensitivity to punishment cues. Children who show these temperamental features aren't destined for antisocial development, but they may be more vulnerable to it in certain environments. What those environments look like varies considerably. Research has pointed to early exposure to inconsistent caregiving, where the adults in a child's life are unpredictable, sometimes warm and sometimes cold or harmful, in ways that can't be anticipated or made sense of. In these conditions, some children develop an adaptive strategy of emotional detachment, stop depending on others' consistency, stop investing in approval that may or may not come, stop treating other people's responses as meaningful signals. This strategy, in the short term, can be protective. In the long term, it can calcify into a persistent orientation toward the world in which other people's inner lives simply don't register as important. This doesn't mean everyone who grew up in a difficult environment develops antisocial patterns. The vast majority don't. And it doesn't mean that a difficult environment is required. Some people with strongly antisocial profiles describe relatively stable early lives. The developmental pathways are multiple, and the science here is still genuinely incomplete. What's useful to understand is that by the time antisocial patterns are fully established in adulthood, they typically feel to the person like just the way things are, like reality, not distortion. They don't experience themselves as lacking something. They experience other people as excessively burdened by emotions and obligations that don't actually serve them. From inside the antisocial worldview, the person who forgives a wrong because they care about the relationship looks naive. The person who feels guilty for something that wasn't witnessed looks foolish. The person who prioritizes fairness over advantage looks like they're playing the game badly. There's a version of this worldview that some researchers have described as a kind of cynical realism, the belief that everyone is fundamentally self-interested, that social norms are a performance most people maintain because they're afraid or because they haven't thought carefully enough, and that the antisocial person is simply one of the few honest enough to operate openly on that basis. This framing, when held internally, makes the antisocial individual feel not like someone with a deficit, but like someone who sees clearly, more clear-eyed, not less human. This is worth understanding because it shapes everything about how these individuals respond when confronted, challenged, or asked to change. If you believe your way of seeing the world is more realistic than other people's, then criticism of your behavior doesn't land as feedback, it lands as an attempt to impose someone else's naive, sentimental framework on you, and you handle it accordingly. Let's talk about impulsivity now, because it's one of the more overlooked dimensions of antisocial psychology and one of the most practically significant. Antisocial behavior isn't always calculated. In fact, a hallmark of this profile in many people is a striking difficulty with delayed gratification, an orientation toward immediate outcomes that can override longer-term considerations, even when those longer-term considerations matter enormously. Researchers who study decision-making have found that individuals with high antisocial trait scores often show reduced sensitivity to future consequences. The threat of a bad outcome tomorrow weighs less against the pull of a rewarding action today. This isn't universal, as we've discussed. Some highly strategic individuals show great patience when the reward is large enough, but impulsivity is woven through the antisocial profile at a fundamental level. What this looks like in practice is a pattern of choices that seem bizarre to outside observers. Walking away from a good job for no obvious reason, ending relationships that were going well, apparently on a whim, making financial decisions that create obvious problems without seeming to factor in consequences that any outside observer could see coming. Taking risk with other people's well-being, in traffic, in emotional commitments, in shared responsibilities that feel cavalier in a way that can shade into recklessness. The impulsivity isn't random or stupid, though. It follows a consistent logic. This feels right now, the future cost is abstract, and other people's stake in my decisions is not a meaningful variable. It's the same reduced weight on others' experience showing up in the dimension of time rather than relationship. This also helps explain why antisocial patterns so frequently intersect with instability in employment, in relationships, in living situations, in legal standing. Not because antisocial individuals can't be smart or capable, but because the cognitive and emotional machinery that produces stable long-term outcomes, to sensitivity to consequences, investment in others' trust, willingness to tolerate short-term friction for long-term gain, is precisely the machinery that runs at reduced capacity in this profile. Now let's address something that comes up every time antisocial psychology is discussed seriously, the question of responsibility. There's a real tension here. On one hand, understanding the psychological and developmental roots of antisocial behavior makes it easier to see these patterns as emerging from somewhere, from biology, from environment, from the interaction of the two, rather than appearing out of pure moral failure. That's important for understanding. On the other hand, antisocial behavior causes real harm to real people. The fact that it has origins in psychology and development doesn't remove the damage done to those who experience it, and it certainly doesn't obligate those people to stay in damaging situations in order to honor the nuance. Both of these things can be true at the same time. Understanding antisocial psychology doesn't mean excusing it. It means having a more accurate map of what you're dealing with, which turns out to be the most useful thing anyone can have when navigating these situations. When you understand the mechanism, you stop waiting for the moment of genuine remorse that may not be coming. You stop expecting the conversation that will make them truly understand your perspective. You stop confusing charm for warmth or absence of conflict for resolution. You see the pattern for what it is, and that clarity, however uncomfortable, is what actually protects you. Psychologists who work with people who've been in relationships with antisocial individuals often describe a specific kind of recovery that comes from exactly this cognitive shift. Not from finally getting the apology they deserved, or the acknowledgement that never came, but from understanding that the rules of the relationship were never what they thought they were, and that this was always about the other person's psychology, not about their own inadequacy or failure to be good enough. That realization changes everything, even though it also requires grieving something real. The person they thought they knew, and the relationship they believed they were in. Let's close by talking about what antisocial behavior reveals, not about the rare extremes, but about human psychology more broadly. One of the reasons the psychology of antisocial individuals is worth understanding, even if you've never encountered someone deeply in this profile, is that it illuminates something about the rest of us, by contrast. The empathy we experience, the guilt we feel when we've harmed someone, the discomfort of behaving inconsistently with our values, these things can feel like burdens sometimes. They complicate life, they create obligations, they mean that other people's pain becomes your pain in some form. Most of us have wished, at some point, that we could just not care so much. But what the research on antisocial psychology makes visible is that these mechanisms, the empathy, the guilt, the relational investment, are not just emotional weight. They're the architecture of sustainable human connection. They're what makes trust possible. They're what makes long-term relationships work. They're what allows groups of people to cooperate, to honor commitments, to build something together. The discomfort of caring about others is, in a very real sense, the price of being part of something larger than yourself. Antisocial individuals don't pay that price, and as a result, they can't access what it buys. The relationships they have tend to be either purely instrumental or short-lived or both. The intimacy that comes from genuine mutual vulnerability, from actually letting another person's experience matter to you, is largely unavailable to them. That's not nothing. From the outside, the antisocial orientation can look like freedom, or power, or clarity. From the inside, if you look carefully, it tends to look like a very efficient machine for extracting short-term benefit from a social world that remains, on some fundamental level, perpetually foreign. There's something in that worth thinking about, not as a reason to feel superior, The psychological structures you were born with and raised into are not moral achievements, yours or anyone else's, but as a reminder of what it means when you do care, when you feel guilty after hurting someone and do something about it. When you stay in a difficult relationship because you value the other person, even when it costs you something, when you tell the truth even when a lie would be easier, these things aren't weaknesses, they're what the architecture of genuine human connection actually looks like in practice. The psychology of antisocial behavior is, at its core, a study in what happens when that architecture is missing or significantly reduced. And the more clearly we understand it, the better equipped we are to recognize it, to protect ourselves from it, and to understand, with a little more precision, what the rest of us actually have that's worth holding on to. If this kind of exploration of human psychology is something you want more of, the parts we don't usually talk about, the mechanisms behind the patterns, then subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment below. Have you recognized any of these patterns in someone you've known